On this page of notes, we have some new language to introduce and some equations that go with this language, and specifically that is period of motion and frequency of motion. So what does this language mean? What does period of motion mean? Well, as it says here, period of motion means time, right? The amount of time it takes for an object to go around once, one complete revolution. So in terms of variables, we're going to use capital T for period, and the units for period of motion will be seconds. Frequency of motion. Well, frequency of motion is the number of revolutions. How frequently is the object going around, and how frequently does it go around? The number of revolutions either per second or per minute or per hour or whatever time interval is of interest in the problem. If the time interval is per second, so if frequency, how frequently does it go around, is the number of revolutions per second, then we introduce this unit h sub z, which is hertz, because a number, of course, is just a number. For example, let's say it was 3 revolutions per second. So we would have 3. Revolutions is just a word. There's not a unit for revolution, right? So it could be, you could say 3 cycles per second. So it's just a word. So the unit on the top is just 1, and seconds, of course, is on the bottom. So 1 hertz, right, equals 1 on seconds. Okay. Well, let's take a look at a numerical example for both period of motion and frequency of motion together to get a little better understanding of the two. What if we know, or we've measured, that it takes an object 2 seconds to make 6 revolutions? So I count off 6 revolutions and my stopwatch says that took 2 seconds. Well, the frequency of motion, and the variable as it says here is f, right, is 6 revolutions per 2 seconds. So here we have our 3 revolutions per second, or 3 hertz. Well, let's think now about the period of motion, the amount of time it took that object to go around once. Well, it made 3 revolutions every second. So that means in 1/3 of a second, it must have gone around once if it's moving at a uniform rate. So as we have here, as long as you will remember that period of motion and frequency of motion are inverses of each other, it does not matter whether you want to memorize that period is 1 on frequency or frequency is 1 on period, you get it right. So the bottom line is you need to memorize that frequency and period of motion are the reciprocals of each other. Period of motion is the amount of time to go around once, and the frequency of motion is frequently the revolutions per second. Well, I just have a little bit of algebra with some of the other equations that we've talked about in this course to show you what some of these equations can look like in problems that you may be solving. We know speed equals distance over time, so that's not an issue. The distance traveled when you're in circular motion is 2 pi r, and if it's once around the circle, which is what 2 pi r is, then little t becomes capital T. So speed is 2 pi r over the period, and since we know frequency and period are reciprocals, that also equals 2 pi r f. So these are equations that we'll see as we do homework problems. Now, how about acceleration in terms of period and frequency? So we may be asked to relate the radial acceleration to the period of motion and frequency. Radial acceleration is v squared on r, so we're just going to plod right along. V is distance over time, 2 pi r on period, so we square the whole thing on top, so 4 pi squared r squared divided by t squared, but notice we have an r squared down here, or an r squared, we have an r down here to cancel one of the r squareds on the top, so that is why we get 4 pi squared r over t squared, and of course period and frequency are reciprocal, so we get 4 pi squared r f squared. You definitely do not want to memorize all of these bits. What you should memorize, let me erase here, so I can help you out a little bit here with trying to memorize the fundamental equations, but not every single equation we deal with. You definitely need to know that period is 1 on f, and F is 1 on period. So that one's a memorize. You have to know that. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of what I memorize or just know speed equals distance over time, and I'll even derive these if I need to, right? And certainly I memorize acceleration radial equals v squared on r, and then I'll derive these as needed within different homework problems. So again, we all have different capacities to memorize, and some of us are very good at memorizing all of our equations. You're, of course, welcome to memorize whatever you feel you need to, but in terms of trying to maybe minimize your amount of memorization, hopefully that helps you out. Well, so this new language of period and frequency will definitely play a role in our circular motion problems, so we needed to introduce those concepts in these equations. So let me erase and clean this up for you so you can get this down, and we will move on.